Hello upgraders and welcome to another episode of the Upgraded Ape Show. I'm your host Will Barron and today we're going to talk about porn. That's right, we're going to talk about porn. I don't want you to turn off, I want you to continue listening because this show is for you if you want to have more motivation, if you want to eliminate brain fog and if you want to improve your cognitive performance. Gary Wilson joins me on today's show to talk about how internet porn can reduce brain performance in both men and women. Gary starts by going over some of the scientific studies that show internet porn can be a real addiction, and then we move into how it messes with your reward centers. This leads us on to dopamine, which is a hormone that drives motivation, impulse control, and if it's messed around with, it can lead to a lack of confidence, brain fog, depression, and more. I share a personal anecdote in this story, Gary tells a couple more, and the reason why I asked Gary specifically to come on to talk about this issue is because he's dove into the science, and he brings up a lot of studies in our conversation. So here we go. Without further ado, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show, your daily dose of brain upgrades to help you kick life's ass. And here's your host, Will Barron.
Hi Gary, and welcome to the Upgraded Ape Show.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm good, mate. Are you okay today?
I am. I'm good.
Awesome stuff. Do you want to just give us a very quick background of what you do, your website, and then we'll dive into some questions?
Well, yeah, I have a website called yourbrainonporn.com, which went online about 4 years ago. And so it's really about the effects of high-speed internet porn on mainly guys. And the reason it came online is because some men started showing up on my wife's website about 8 years ago, which had nothing to do with porn. It was about relationships, and yet they showed up because we had articles there about the neurobiology of sex and bonding and orgasm. And so a lot of words that they'd be interested in if they had sexual problems were on that site. So Google put those together. The guys started showing up. They started posting and saying, hey, we got problems with our dicks. Can you help us? And we're like, what are you doing here? Well, Google will put their posts together and more showed up and they started helping each other until her site was completely flooded with a bunch of guys trying to recover from porn's effects. And then we started blogging about some of the surprising results they had when they gave up porn on Psychology Today. It exploded even more. And finally, we decided, okay, we needed a separate website for them because they've just overrun hers. And then my site, yourbrainonporn.com, just blew up also. So it's just been one of those things that's just occurred without us wanting it to. And just want to do a little caveat. Neither of us are religious and we're very liberal. So this has nothing to do with moralizing. It was just we saw some negative effects that reversed themselves when these guys gave up porn.
And just to emphasize that, I came across your site through a Reddit thread that was talking about essentially brain benefits and concentration benefits from giving up masturbation and internet porn. So there's, from my perspective as well, there's no issue with porn or anything like that. I want to focus on the positives of, the positives and the potential issues with internet porn.
Okay.
Let's just drive straight into it then. And my first question is to give us a quick summary and to give an overview of what internet porn is doing to both men and women's brains when they're watching it.
Well, that's a huge question. We could spend several hours on it. So if we look at evidence, there are 3 recent studies just in the last few months that actually started to look at the brains of guys who use internet porn. And they were really looking at addiction-related changes. So there's 2 major studies. 2 of them by Cambridge found the same addiction-related brain changes you see in addicts. They also found that about half of the men suffered from erectile dysfunction. So they found the brain changes you see in other addictions. Now, the interesting study was put out in May by the Max Planck Institute, and that one was not of addicts. In fact, that one correlated years and hours of porn use with some changes in the brain. Now, what were these changes? First, there was less gray matter in certain parts of the reward circuit. Gray matter means nerve connections, so they had less nerve connections, and these were in centers that were for sexuality and also for motivation, so there was just less of it. Now, those same guys who had less gray matter in the reward circuit also had less arousal when exposed to sexual images. So that was surprising. And another surprising finding is that the same men, the more porn they used, the less connections they had between the frontal cortex and the reward circuitry. Now, this is often called hypofrontality. Hypo is low, frontal means frontal cortex. So this is one of the structural signs that your frontal cortex, which is the seat of so many of our, higher brain functions, isn't functioning up to speed. So those are some of the brain studies, only 3 of them on porn addicts, and 3 of them found significant brain changes. But these 3 brain studies are not in isolation. We've had, in the last few years, there are 85 internet addiction brain studies, and a lot of them have looked at the frontal cortex. About half of them are video games, about half of them are general internet, and they didn't isolate porn users, but they have found significant brain changes, and these brain changes mimic those of people who have been using drugs. And a lot of them look at the frontal cortex, and they do find this hypofrontality. They also find cognitive deficits. And 4 of the brain studies, internet addiction brain studies, actually followed users through recovery, and the brain changes and the cognitive deficits reversed themselves. So that's pretty impressive.
Is it true? I read this that they were struggling to do studies because they couldn't find anyone in the Western world that wasn't addicted to porn.
Well, there's lots of reasons why there aren't good studies. Yes, it's not that they're not addicted. It's not finding people who haven't used porn. So even in the studies I mentioned, the one Cambridge study, which had definitely looked at addicts' brains, they had a couple of control groups. The control groups, the people had used porn, but they weren't addicted according to their assessment. The Max Planck study, they just correlated the years and the amount of use per week with brain changes. So yes, you can do studies, but there's actually a big political opposition to doing the type of studies that would be necessary to find the problems that are occurring.
One thing I do want to dive into, and you mentioned it then with relation to the grey matter and reward circuits, is motivation. Can you just explain quickly what you mean by the reward circuit and how that could potentially affect the motivation of someone?
Yeah, so the reward circuit is a bunch of structures. They're ancient structures that are shared by all mammals, and they're pretty small, and they're about in the center of the brain, and they go by such fancy names as the nucleus accumbens and the amygdala and the hippocampus, and et cetera. But the purpose of these structures is to reward you, to motivate you to do activities that further your survival or the survival of your genes. So we can think about the reward circuit as lighting up, becoming active when we engage in eating food, drinking water, engaging in sex, bonding, falling in love, making friendships, even exercise. So it's constantly activated to make you want to do all those activities that further your survival. Achievement, being the top dog, those also activate the reward circuit. Now, the reward circuit runs on lots of neurochemicals, but the main one that's been studied is dopamine. So dopamine is the gas that powers the reward circuit. And even though the reward circuit gives us feelings of, oh, that feels great when I eat a Twinkie or potato chips or have an orgasm, dopamine is not the feelings of, oh, that feels good. Those are endorphin-like molecules. Dopamine is the motivation. It's the craving. It's the urging. So if you've just eaten a big meal at a restaurant and you're full, and yet the dessert tray comes around and you see a yummy chocolate cake or ice cream or something like that, dopamine rises and urges you to overcome your feelings of fullness to go after the dense, high-calorie foods. Because in the past, that furthered your survival, the consumption of high-calorie foods. Not so much anymore. So it pushes you to do those things. And it pushes you especially to do the most important thing that you can, and that's reproduce. So dopamine is highest during sexual activity and peaks at orgasm.
Okay.
So that's the reward circuit. Now, if we step back, dopamine is motivation. It's motivation to do anything. If you remove dopamine and block it in animals, they will not eat. They will starve to death. You can drop yummy food in a rat's mouth and it will eat it, but it has no motivation to go after it. So dopamine is the motivation molecule. Now the reward circuit not only is activated, but it sends out dopamine to the other parts of the brain, including the frontal cortex. So the frontal cortex, with all the motivation, the thinking, cognition, impulse control, it is powered by the reward circuit sending dopamine up to that higher part of the brain. If dopamine is low or inhibited in the reward circuit, it will affect all the other parts of the brain that need its dopamine. So that's a very important point. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does for sure.
So some of the effects that have been studied of low dopamine, chronically low dopamine, or low dopamine receptors, those are the little hands that stick out on nerve cells that catch dopamine, are such things as low sexual desire, brain fog, concentration problems, lack of motivation, lack of confidence, depression. Depression is mainly dopamine, it's not serotonin. So a lot of these things are associated with low dopamine.
And that is all the stuff that I'd love to dive into specifically, and to give an anecdote to, and you will have hundreds of examples, I'm sure, but give an anecdote to the listeners. I know Tim Ferriss recently did a no booze, no masturbation 30-day challenge, and I did this myself from some of the pages on your site and then some of the stuff I'd read. I did this like a year or so ago, and 30 days without orgasm or masturbation, and I was absolutely driven and motivated in ways that I'd never been. It was absolutely incredible. It was a really bizarre feeling.
Yeah, and that's interesting because we hear that again and again. You know, the guys that showed up early, it's changed since then. They showed up because they had sexual problems such as erectile dysfunction, low libido, and strange porn taste. And when they started to give up porn, they started to see other benefits. And the number two, there's two of them that were at the top of the list for most guys, the most widespread. And that's better cognitive function. They'd often say that the brain fog went away, and more motivation. So those two really occur almost universally with guys who give up internet porn, and some do give up masturbation, some don't. That's highly variable.
And I think it's worth emphasizing as well that this isn't like masturbation this isn't motivation to go and get laid or anything. This for me personally was motivation to do well with my business and go and do all sorts of extra stuff that, you know, usually you'd come back and maybe watch TV, but I was really driven instead.
Yeah. So if you think about it, dopamine is there to motivate you to seek rewards. And often we'll say, oh, rewards are sex and food, but achievement is a big reward. I mean, think about billionaires. They have enough money to last them for 10,000 lifetimes, but they still want to make the next deal, you know, make more money. So achievement is a huge reward that is motivated through dopamine. So the guys who give up porn, they find that they may go back to school, they start reading books, they start taking courses, they take up hobbies that they gave up when they're 12 years old. So yes, we see this again and again, is better cognitive effects, more motivation, and just better spirits, more just generally happier also.
Okay, so for listeners who are listening now, is there a way to tell if you potentially have a porn problem?
Well, that's a big question because, when I first got into this, we were dealing with guys who were just addicted. And that's all I dealt with. But as the years went by, the last 3 or 4 years, I've seen that even people who aren't addicted or use porn a couple times a week are affected and don't know it. And that effect is usually sexual. They give up porn and sex becomes a lot better. They have more motivation to pursue real partners. Everything feels better. So that's even married people. But in terms of the answer to the question is do what you did. Give it up. Remove the variable. See what happens. But I have a caveat here is because if you are truly addicted or close to being addiction, because brain changes are on a spectrum, you can get worse before you get better. So those guys who are addicted or close to addiction, when they give up porn, they often enter what they call a flat line, where they have depression, their libido goes down, their motivation goes down. They might have withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, brain fog, many other problems, inability to sleep. So some people get worse before they get better. That's why a lot of people see benefits in a month's time, yet many do not, and they have to go for several months to even past a year to see the benefits. So it depends really on the condition of your brain.
Okay. And we've talked a lot about men here, but does this affect women as well?
Well, almost all my recovery stories, rebooting stories, are from men. So that's a hard question to answer. Clearly, men, through all the studies, use porn far more than women. But it wasn't long ago, about a year ago, that we did an article about women in porn. And what we did is we went over to NoFap Reddit, one of the most popular websites where they give up porn. And we searched for women's names because they would put a flare next to their name. They make their name pink. And we looked at the conditions that they're complaining about. And I thought it'd be just women who were complaining about their boyfriends, but the vast majority of them were having sexual problems. So yes, it is affecting women, but it is affecting men more. And here's the other thing is men are more likely to notice the problems because we have a nice little barometer, which is called our penis. And if your penis doesn't work so well, or you're just not sexually excited as a 22-year-old, you know something's wrong. Whereas a female, if she's not sexually excited, the meme is, oh, well, it's just because that's how I am, or my partner's just not doing it right. But a guy is always supposed to be sexually excited. So I think a lot of women who are using may be affected and yet never make the connection. Because a lot of the guys who end up with complete ED, their penis won't even work, it often takes them years to make the connection between their ED and their porn use. So I can just imagine how hard it is for women.
And that was a question I was going to ask of how many people do you think are addicted to porn or have issues with viewing internet porn, but don't realize it, and they may have ED and they're on, different drugs or under different doctor therapies, leading on to the question of, is this something that doctors are aware of? And is it something that they'll talk, like GPs will talk to their patients about?
Well, some urologists and many therapists are becoming aware of it, but there's a huge gap between the studies, and that's what doctors look to, is they look to studies, and they actually look to drug companies telling them about studies. So there's a huge gap between the studies and what's going on because we know that the technology has really exploded. I mean, come on, tube sites, which are YouTube-like sites that have 3-minute clips of videos, they didn't even come online until about 2007. Smartphones, 2009? So the technology has rapidly increased and the availability and free porn has increased, and yet the studies haven't kept up with it. So do I think a lot of people are being affected? Yes. So let's look at a couple of surveys from this summer. There was a survey here in the U.S. Of 18 to 30-year-olds. 23% of the men thought they were addicted. 10% suspected they were addicted but weren't sure. So that's 1/3 of the population. Now think about it. Most guys who show up on these forums and complain of problems say they never thought they had a problem until they stopped using. So most people don't suspect a problem because they use it all the time.
Uh-huh.
A Japanese survey from 2010 found that 36% of guys ages 16 to 19 didn't want to have anything to do with sex. That's ages 16 to 19. And that percentage doubled in just 2 years. So that's pretty amazing. Now think back to Kinsey. Kinsey, the first guy who researched, 1948, came out with his famous study on men, looked at erectile dysfunction. He found that under 20, less than 1% had ED. Under 45, less than 3%. A study came out in the summer, unusual study of 16 to 21-year-olds, and it found that 54% of the males, 16 to 21, reported sexual problems. 27% had ED, 24% had low libido, 10% had problems with orgasm. These percentages are higher than the females, which never happens in any studies, and these percentages are higher than middle-aged men. Something is going on here.
I really appreciate you bringing numbers into it and making it more quantifiable and the scientific side of it as well. But those numbers are crazy, aren't they?
They are crazy. And when we talk about anecdotes and the guys who do their recovery stories and they recover from ED and they tell us about their friends, pretty much everyone agrees that almost all guys are using porn. Now, guys meaning ages 14 through 30. That's the prime group that seems to be affected because they grew up using internet porn. So it's pretty much accepted that the majority of young men use internet porn. And here's the deal. As we think about porn, porn's been around forever. But when you think about me, age 58, if I looked at porn, it was like a still picture of a naked woman. If I masturbated to that, I still used my imagination. I still thought about whatever I could think of. And maybe the only thing I could think about was feeling her up because that's the only experience I had. Now, a 12-year-old can go online and have 3-minute clips all lined up in 20 tabs of the hardest core porn, and they're videos. And that's the key thing, they're videos. And his sexuality is shaped by the porn because he's watching real people have real sex and he's masturbating to it for most of his masturbation sessions for years until he has his first kiss at age 16. So it's shaping sexuality. And of course, the adolescent brain is highly malleable, and one of the main purposes of the adolescent brain is to mold itself to the environment so it can successfully reproduce. So that's what he's doing for years. So it's not surprising to us that young people are having problems. But the other thing is the young guys are taking so much longer to recover from erectile dysfunction. Sometimes 9 months, sometimes a year, sometimes 2 years. You compare this to 50-year-old guys who show up on the websites and say, you know, I have ED. It only takes them a month or two and they're back in the saddle. So it shows you the power of shaping your sexuality during adolescence.
Cool. Well, I just want to touch on one last thing before we go through some quick fire questions, and that is the rebooting process. Is there a specific protocol that listeners can look into? And is there specific things that need to be done to either increase the speed or increase the effectiveness of rebooting from a porn addiction?
Yeah, well, so rebooting is a term the guys came up with. And the only rule is that you remove all artificial sexual stimuli. However, most guys also remove masturbation or really cut back on it a lot. And so when I say artificial sexual stimuli, that means not only porn, but removing things like surfing Craigslist or surfing Facebook for pictures or looking at YouTube. In other words, remove artificial sexual stimuli so you can reorientate your brain to real people. And removing masturbation is temporary, like it was with you. And I think sometimes that's beneficial just to see that maybe that your level of masturbation wasn't really driven by libido or being horny. It was actually driven by the use of internet porn. So that might be a good thing too. And also, if you remove masturbation for a period, you unhook masturbation from the screen. And that's sort of a good thing, because this is the first time in history that guys sat around and masturbated to a screen for every masturbation session. So I think it's good to unwire those two events. So that's the only rules. But again, I just want to point out that some people will actually get worse before they get better if they do have a problem.
Cool. Okay, Gary. Well, how about we learn a bit more about you and we do some quickfire questions?
Okay.
So, non-porn related, what is your best productivity hack?
Well, I don't know if I have one, but my best one is watching my wife as an example, because she is highly productive. And as soon as any job comes in front of her, she jumps on it immediately. So I just use her as an example and try to follow that example.
Good stuff. If you could high five anyone, who would it be?
Well, let's see. Maybe Martin Luther King. I know that's sort of a pat answer, but in my view, he was someone special. And there aren't too many special people in history.
Cool. What is one book that you'd recommend to the Upgraded Ape audience?
Well, the one book I'd recommend is The Brain That Changes Itself by Norman Doidge. That's one that a lot of the guys really find beneficial, and it gives you hope that if you have had problems and you're really deep into porn and your sexual tastes have changed, that yes, you can come out of it and your brain can change.
Yeah, it's an awesome book, and it's been brought up before on the Upgraded Ape Show. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it again. And Gary, I've got one final question for you, and that is something I've asked everyone who's come on the show so far. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be one piece of advice you'd give him to help him either upgrade his brain or just get more done and more out of life?
Well, I'd go back to him and tell the young guy who watched too much TV to cut out all TV from his life and read lots of books and lots of classics. That's what I would tell him. I grew up in the 60s when TV was coming on, and a lot of us sat around and watched a lot of crap. So that's what I would do. Yeah,
great advice. Great answer. So Gary, thanks for your time today. I really appreciated it. Can you give us a bit more information of where we can find out more about you and your work?
Yeah, well, you can go to yourbrainonporn.com, and it's a non-commercial site, no advertisement. And you can look at the videos there. You can look at the articles there. And I also have a book for sale. It's Your Brain on Porn. And all the proceeds, my proceeds from the book, go to further research into porn's effects.
Awesome stuff. Well, cheers, Gary. I just want to say thanks again for your time, and thanks again for all the work you're doing. You've dove into a tough topic, and you're doing really great work, mate.
You bet. Thanks a lot for having me.